In this part of Lecture 6, what we're going to do is continue our discussion of categorization, but the focus is going to be on an explanation of how animals go about engaging in categorization. And in particular, we're going to focus on three theories: the feature theory, the prototype theory, and the exemplar theory. And these three theories have been developed in the context of humans, and then after that they've been applied to the case of animal cognition. So how do animals categorize? And as I just suggested, categorization can be done in different ways. Right? So the processes by which animals and humans assign things to categories can differ. Right? And we're going to discuss three approaches, and we will see that there is some evidence, there is some support for each of these theories. So they might all be true, and animals may use different processes under different situations. So let's start by discussing, kind of to provide the groundwork for our discussion. Let's start by briefly discussing an experiment by Sorella from 1979. So Sorella trained pigeons to peck at pictures of oak leaves and to not peck at silhouettes of pictures of other types of leaves. And so the question is, how do pigeons learn to discriminate, to categorize oak leaves and not oak leaves? So the sample stimuli that they used is listed in the figure here. The top three silhouettes are silhouettes of oak leaves, and the bottom three are silhouettes of non-oak kinds of leaves. So as I said, they learned to peck a key for the top types of leaves, but not to peck them for the bottom ones. Right, so this is a categorization task, right? They're categorizing different types of patterns. And the question is, how do they do so? And the different theories of categorization would explain it in different ways. So let's start with the feature theory. And according to the feature theory, animals solve categorization problems by looking for a unique or distinguishing feature that belongs to a category. Right, so by looking at examples of the category, it figures out that this one feature, or very few features, distinguishes members of the category from members that don't belong in the category. And all members of the category have that feature. So in the case of the oak leaves versus non-oak leaves, the feature might be curved protuberances, right, versus no curved protuberances. So little parts that stick out for the oak leaves are curved. So there would be a process of learning involved here, right? So the presence of the features may gradually become associated with a response, and the absence of those features would be associated with a no response. Right? So what the animal comes to learn is that when you see curved protuberances, respond, and when you don't see them, don't respond. Now, again, these features may be different from the ones that humans use to categorize the different types of leaves. Right? So even if humans and animals can discriminate the different types of leaves, we may not use the same processes, or we might, right? But we can't just assume that the processes are the same. Now, many studies support the feature theory, and I'll only mention one. This is a study by Huber and colleagues. And in this study, they showed pigeons pictures of 50 human male and 50 human female faces. And they wanted to train the pigeons to be able to discriminate them. Right, so one group got a reward for pecking at a key when a male face was presented, but not for pecking at a key when a female face was presented. And the other group was the opposite. They got a reward for pecking at a key when a female face was presented, but not when pecking at a key when a male face was presented. Right, so this is a categorization task. Can you train pigeons to discriminate? Can you teach them to categorize male faces and female faces? So the faces were originally presented in color with the hair removed to make the faces as similar as possible except for the hair. And after they were trained with 100 faces, they were presented with new stimuli to see if these could be categorized correctly. Again, you want to show generalization. And not surprisingly, the pigeons learned to discriminate correctly in the transfer trials. Right? So they discriminated new female faces from male faces. So as far as the theories of categorization goes, the question is, how do they discriminate male and female faces? So to ascertain this, they tried different transformations of the photos, right? So during additional transfer trials. And they did this to try to figure out the relevant features. And what they found was that it was a slight difference in color between male faces and female faces that was the basis of the categorization. So how do they know that? When they presented the faces in black and white, accuracy dropped to chance. Right? So they could no longer discriminate the male and female faces when they were in black and white. So this is consistent with the feature theory, because it says that a small set of features is used to discriminate between categories. Now obviously humans can also discriminate male and female faces, and we don't do it on the basis of differences in color. The features that we use are different. For example, male faces tend to have broader jaw lines, narrower eyes, broader noses, while female faces have narrower jaw lines, bigger eyes, and smaller noses. Okay, so again, the psychologist's fallacy. Just because two different species can discriminate the same stimuli, it doesn't mean to use the same processes. So let's turn now to exemplar theory. So according to this theory, animals remember every instance, right, every exemplar of a category, and the category to which they belong. Right? Instead of storing with a category a single feature by which to identify members, it stores all the examples of the category in memory that it has seen. And then when a new stimulus comes along, it's categorized based on similarity to those examples that are stored in memory. So how would this work with the oak leaves? Well, according to this theory, the animal would store the exemplars of oak leaves pattern for the rewarded category, and new items would be compared, right, for their similarity to those exemplars that it has stored. And one of the nice things about the exemplar theory is that it can explain what is called the exemplar effect. And this is really a simple idea, kind of obvious really, that categorization is usually better for familiar items than for new items. Right, so this is something that the feature theory cannot explain, right? Because the feature theory says that you store in memory, that an animal stores in memory a single feature associated with that category. So it shouldn't matter whether an instance is new or old, right? Because the same feature would be involved in either case. But that's not the case, right? Animals and humans categorize familiar things more quickly than new ones, even if they have the same relevant feature. So this was demonstrated early on by Bott and colleagues. So this study again used pigeons, and the pigeons learned to discriminate between pictures of cats, flowers, cars, and chairs, and they had to do so by pressing one of 4 keys. So each key was associated with a particular category, and they had to pick the right key for the right picture. So in the training trials, there was 10 pictures per category, and they learned to respond to a criterion. And then in the test trials, right, they had 40 old pictures and 40 new pictures of these 4 kinds of items. And they looked at how quickly they learned to categorize these new ones. And they found that performance in the test was better for old items, right? They categorized the old items much more accurately, in the test trials, showing that they had retained some representation of the exemplars and not just some relevant feature associated with each category. Right, again, the feature theory doesn't suggest that there should be a difference between categorizing new items and old items because the same features are involved. The fact that they categorize the old items more accurately and more quickly suggests that they've stored those examples in memory. All right, the third theory of categorization that we'll discuss is called the prototype theory. And this theory holds that animals store in memory a representation of the most typical example of a category. Right, so a prototype is a representation of the most average features, right, the most typical features associated with a category. And new items are categorized based on how similar they are to the prototypes. So in contrast to the exemplar theory, the examples of categories aren't stored in memory. Right? Instead, from all those examples, the animal extracts, right, they abstract a certain set of typical features, features that tend to be seen in that category. And when a new item is presented, they compare the features of that new item to those prototypical features. And the more of those features that it has in common, the more likely it is to be included in the category. So this theory also differs from the feature theory in a couple of ways. First of all, more than one feature is involved in their representation of a category. And second, it does not assume that all members of categories have the same features. Right? So some items may have some features while other items may have other features. All that matters is that they have some of those features in order to be included in the category. So I want to end by discussing an experiment by Cook and Smith. And they examined whether some animals, at least, have both a prototype process and an exemplar process. And they hypothesized that a prototype, that certain animals acquire prototypes early on, right, these abstractions of features, and then exemplars are acquired later, and they are used to categorize exceptions to the rule, exceptions to the category. So what do we mean by an exception? Right, we know that for many categories there are exceptions to the rule. And these are examples that don't seem to have a lot of the features that we tend to associate with a category. Right, so one of the best examples of this is the platypus. Right, the platypus is categorized as a mammal even though it lays eggs. Right, so laying eggs is something that we don't normally associate with mammals, but that's why we have to learn that the platypus is an exception to the rule. All right, so this experiment is really tricky, so I recommend that you go through this a couple times to really understand what's going on here. So in their study, humans and pigeons had to learn to categorize items from two categories, right? Categories that are completely new to them and new to the pigeons and to the humans. So you can see the examples from category 1 and the examples from category 2. Each item is made up of a circle with 6 wedges, and those wedges have different colors. And there are 3 types of items for each category. There's the prototypes, which have the most typical features, and then we have 5 of the typical items, which have most of those features associated with the prototype. And then we have the exceptions, which have very few features of the prototype of that category, and they actually have more in common with members of other categories. So, in this study by Cook and Smith, the participants were shown one item at a time, right? Again, a circle with 6 colored wedges, and they have to categorize it as belonging to category 1 or category 2. Now, since the categories are new to them, initially what's involved is a guess. Right? They guess, and then based on whether they get reinforcement or not, they tailor their performance accordingly. Right? So they only learn whether they're right once they get reinforcement. So the items are shown repeatedly, and they're interested in how quickly they learn to categorize correctly the 3 types of items, right? The prototypes, the typical items, and the exceptions. So since this study is a little tricky, let me go through the items for each category to show what's involved here. So as I said, the prototypes, so let's begin with category 1. The prototypes consist of 6 colored wedges, right? The wedges are red, white, purple, yellow, green, dark green, and gray. And these are the most typical features. So if you look at the examples, if you look at the other examples of the categories, they tend to have these features. So for example, for the typical items, 4 out of 5 of them have the red wedge, 4 out of 5 have the white wedge, 5 out of 5 of them have the yellow wedge, 4 out of 5 dark green, 4 out of 5 purple, and 4 out of 5 gray. Right, so that's why they're called typical members. Each one has actually 5 of the 6 features associated with the prototype. And then the exceptions, right? The exceptions only have 1 out of 6 of the features that are associated with the prototype. So in this case, a dark green wedge, for example. And the exceptions actually have more in common with features of category 2. Right, so initially they might respond, even once they've learned a category, they might, when they see an exception, they might categorize it as belonging to category 2 instead of category 1, so they would have to learn this exception and store it in memory. So for category 2, the prototypes consist of 6 colored wedges, light blue, black, light green, dark blue, pink, and orange. And these are the most typical features, right? The features that are most common across all the category items, the category members. And then for the typical members, for example, 4 out of 5 of them have a light blue wedge, 4 out of 5 have a black wedge, 5 out of 5 pink, 4 out of 5 light green, 4 out of 5 dark blue, and 4 out of 5 orange. Right, so they're typical members because they tend to have most of the features associated with the prototype. Right, 5 out of 6. So again, the exceptions only have 1 out of 6 of these prototypical features, and they actually have more in common with the prototype for category 1. So they have to learn that this is an exception to the rule and store it separately for that category. So let's look at what the pigeons had to do and what the humans had to do. The pigeons were shown 1 stimulus at a time, and then they had to enter one of 2 food hoppers. They had to enter the correct one and peck at a key in order to get a reward. So only if they enter into the correct food hopper do they get a reward. And the humans were shown 1 item at a time, and they had to press a button to indicate which category it belongs to, 1 or 2. And then they were told as they responded whether or not they were correct. And what they were interested in was, for each species, how quickly do they learn to categorize correctly, beyond chance, the 3 types of items. Right, so how long does it take them to categorize correctly the prototypes, the typical items, and the exceptions? And these are the results. So beginning with humans on the left, we have accuracy, right, from 0 to 100%. 50% would be chance, right, would be they're guessing. And then we have the number of blocks on the x-axis. And what you can see is that they learn to categorize the prototypes correctly. faster than any of the other items. And the second fastest was the typical items. They got accurate very quickly, but not as quickly as for the prototypes. And they were slowest to learn the exceptions to the rule. And we see a very similar pattern with the pigeons, right? As blocks increased, their accuracy to categorize the prototypes increased the fastest, and then the typical items were the second fast. And again, it took them a long time to learn the exceptions to the rule. Okay, so the figures show how average accuracy changes across blocks of trials. And for both species, accuracy increased the fastest for the prototypes, which are indicated by the black dots, and then the typical items, which are the clear triangles. And the learning was the slowest for the exceptions. Right, so for both species, they didn't get better than chance, reliably better than chance, until about halfway through the experiment. And what they argue is that this shows that both species acquired a prototype very early on. Right? They abstracted a prototype very early on, and then there was a gradual learning of exceptions, right? A gradual learning of the exemplars that are exceptions to the rule. Right? And this suggests that they have two modes of categorization. Alright, so we've seen that there is some evidence for all three theories of categorization, right? The feature theory, the exemplar theory, and the prototype theory. And what more recent research has examined is the contextual factors, right? The specific tasks and situations that determine which process an animal might use to categorize a stimulus. Okay, so that's all we're going to say about categorization for now, although a lot of the other lectures can really be seen as other explorations of the topic of categorization.